Pharaoh Ramesses III seized Egypt's throne, and his power recognized no boundaries, no opposition, stretching from Thebes' holy sanctuaries to the distant edges where sand met horizon. In his mind, he transcended the role of mortal king. He embodied a living god, divinity walking the earth in human form. But underneath the shimmering mask of godly rule, darkness crept through the kingdom like poison. Those who challenged Egypt's might, who dared defy the pharaoh's supremacy, had been annihilated in warfare. Their warriors lay scattered as bones in the wasteland, their standards burned to nothing, their territories absorbed into Egypt's ever-growing domain. Yet for Ramesses, winning battles was never enough. He grasped that genuine domination demanded more than defeating armies. It required wiping rebellion from memory itself, ensuring no trace of defiance survived. The men who opposed him received death, a quick, merciful end. But their wives, the women who survived them, these women faced a fate beyond comprehension. What Ramesses III unleashed upon them remains one of the most horrifying acts in ancient Egyptian history. If you're drawn to these dark corners of the past, smash that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me what part of the world you're listening from. It honestly astounds me how people from every nation gather in this space, bound by fascination with the shadows that shaped human history. Your support breathes life into these forgotten stories. This is not legend. This is not speculation whispered across millennia. Every detail exists in writing, preserved in the judicial papyrus of Turin, the very document that would later expose the pharaoh's notorious Harem Conspiracy. Buried within those ancient papyrus sheets lies a lesser-known narrative, a chronicle of retribution, of punishment, transformed into public spectacle. Ramesses III did not simply eliminate his adversaries. He weaponized their suffering. His version of justice bore no resemblance to mercy. It was pure theater, a deliberate performance of cruelty designed to demonstrate that even the wives of those who defied him could not escape the reach of Egypt's god-king. So let us journey back to Thebes, to the palace chambers where pharaohs passed judgment not merely on the accused, but on everyone connected to them through kinship, devotion, or matrimony. The Egypt inherited by Ramesses III was a dying empire desperately clutching at past magnificence. In earlier generations, the pharaohs of the new kingdom had commanded wealth beyond comprehension, their treasuries overflowing, their authority unquestioned across vast territories. But by the time Ramesses assumed power, the empire was in critical decline. Generations of military campaigns, widespread famine, and systematic corruption had hollowed out its foundations. The magnificent temples still blazed with gold leaf and precious stones, but venture beyond those sacred walls and you would find a population starving. Food supplies had dwindled catastrophically. The soldiers who had once marched for glory and honor now fought primarily for daily rations. Hostile forces gathered along every frontier. From the western deserts, Libyan war parties launched devastating raids. The Sea Peoples, mysterious maritime warriors from across the Mediterranean, hammered Egypt's coastal settlements with relentless ferocity. Even within the royal palace itself, allegiance had become uncertain. Court officials conducted hushed conversations in shadowed hallways, household servants collected information, and the royal women remained vigilant, searching for any indication of vulnerability. Ramesses III, who would become Egypt's final great pharaoh, perceived treachery in every direction. His rule was maintained through intimidation rather than inspiration. Every perceived threat, whether substantiated or merely imagined, was answered with merciless punishment. The pharaoh systematically expanded his control, establishing elaborate spy networks throughout Thebes, Memphis, and every royal administrative center. His influence penetrated every region of the kingdom, even infiltrating the most intimate aspects of his enemies' existence. When opposing kingdoms attempted rebellion, Egypt's military machine crushed them without hesitation. But military victory alone failed to satisfy Ramesses. He craved something deeper than conquest. He demanded their complete degradation. He wanted their identities erased from history, their family lines terminated, their legacy consumed like incense in temple rituals. And in his calculation, the women who survived these conflicts were inseparable from that legacy. The wives of his vanquished enemies, whether queens, priestesses, or aristocratic women, received no clemency. In his twisted jurisprudence, guilt transferred through marriage. Punishment became a collective sentence. They were transported to Thebes not as conventional prisoners of war, but as living warnings, human symbols demonstrating what befell anyone who challenged Egypt's living divinity. They would soon discover that compassion had been permanently banished from the pharaoh's court. The sun descended toward the western horizon as the captive women reached Thebes. The Nile itself seemed to bleed crimson in the fading light, as though the river carried the blood of the defeated. Vessels approached the great city, their cargo not merchandise or tribute, but human lives. These were the wives and daughters of conquered leaders. Several had ruled as queens in their homelands. Others had served as priestesses to deities now forbidden. Still others were noblewomen from cities that had been razed to nothing. Now they stood in terrified silence, their wrists restrained with linen bindings, their eyes locked on the massive gates of the pharaoh's capital. The streets overflowed with military personnel and civilians. Crowds assembled to observe, murmuring among themselves that these were the wives of Egypt's conquered enemies. Women who had once adorned themselves with gold now walked unshod through the dust of subjugation. For the spectators, this procession represented a demonstration of absolute power. For the pharaoh, it was carefully orchestrated theater. Every footfall was calculated to establish that Egypt's divine sovereign could humble even the most proud foreign queens. Within the palace complex, arrangements had already been completed. The Hall of Judgment glowed with oil lamps casting flickering shadows across walls carved with images of gods weighing mortal souls. But this was no legitimate trial. There would be no balanced scales, no possibility of acquittal. The pharaoh had predetermined their punishment. Every captive was systematically recorded by royal scribes. Their names were transcribed, their homelands documented, their families officially designated as enemies of Egypt. Their identities were catalogued exclusively so they could be methodically eliminated. For the women themselves, the uncertainty was more agonizing than physical restraints. No one informed them why they had been preserved alive or what torment awaited them. That evening, the palace corridors resonated with sounds of victory celebrations. Priests performed triumphant hymns while soldiers consumed their feast. But beyond the torchlight, in the darkened courtyards, the captive women gathered together, whispering desperate prayers to deities who had abandoned them. In a temple administrative chamber, a scribe dispassionately recorded that among the prisoners were wives of rebellious princes, summoned to appear before His Majesty for sentencing. No additional information was documented, only the notation that they were transferred to the women's quarters within the royal compound. The phrase seemed innocuous enough, but those who served in the pharaoh's household understood its true significance. Once a woman entered that location, she never emerged. The women's quarters occupied a remote section deep within the palace grounds, a location referenced only in fearful whispers. Official accounts described it as a luxurious sanctuary where royal wives and concubines lived in opulence. But behind those ornately carved doors existed something fundamentally different. For the captives of Ramesses III, this was not a residence of privilege. It was a prison of enforced silence. The chambers were architecturally impressive, yet emotionally vacant, stripped of precious metals, filled exclusively with the echo of footsteps and overwhelming dread. Armed guards patrolled every corridor, their faces concealed behind linen masks, their instructions unambiguous. No communication leaves these walls. Every window was blocked with decorative lattice stonework. Natural light could barely penetrate. This was a cage disguised as elegance, architecturally designed to remind its inhabitants that even surrounded by beauty, they possessed no agency. The women were segregated according to their former status. Those of royal lineage received private chambers. The remainder were confined to communal halls, sleeping on woven reed mats. Their meals were deliberately minimal: bread, dried dates, and Nile water. Their jewelry and fine garments were confiscated, replaced with simple linen robes bearing the pharaoh's official seal. It was systematic humiliation, methodically executed. Their previous identities were dismantled, fragment by fragment, until they became nothing except trophies of the pharaoh's dominance. For the court scribes, their existence was reduced to administrative entries, inventories of foreign names accompanied by the single word, "captured." But among themselves, the women desperately clung to fragments of possibility. Some whispered about potential ransom negotiations. Others maintained hope that the pharaoh might eventually grant them release. But they fundamentally misunderstood who Ramesses III was. This was the identical pharaoh who had survived assassination attempts within his own harem, the same ruler who believed that rebellion germinated in women's hearts, that wives could nurture treachery as naturally as they nurtured children. For him, punishing his enemies' wives was not sadistic excess. It was strategic necessity, a permanent lesson inscribed into bloodlines, guaranteeing that no descendant of rebellion would ever threaten Egypt again. Days transformed into weeks. The prisoners were compelled to appear before priests who recited mandatory loyalty declarations. They were commanded to renounce their ancestral gods, to prostrate themselves before Egypt's divine hierarchy. Some submitted to these demands. Others maintained defiant silence, their eyes refusing to yield, their lips sealed shut. And those who resisted disappeared entirely. No witness observed where they were transported, but each morning the guards removed linen-wrapped bundles too rigid to contain fabric. When reports reached Ramesses III that certain captives continued resisting him, he displayed no anger. Instead, he smiled. For a pharaoh, punishment was never chaotic improvisation. It was sacred ceremony. And in Egypt, ceremony defined reality. Commands were dispatched throughout Thebes announcing a new ritual. It would not be commemorated among official festivals of military triumph. Nevertheless, everyone comprehended its meaning. The priests designated it the purification of foreign elements. To the general population, it represented justice made visible, vengeance cloaked in religious sanction. The appointed day arrived under a merciless sun. Massive crowds assembled outside the temple courtyard where incense smoke rose like battlefield haze. Drums thundered, ceremonial trumpets blared, and the captives were paraded forward barefoot, draped in pale linen, the identifying marks of their original kingdom still faintly visible in their tattoos and remaining ornaments. They were positioned before towering statues of Egypt's gods while scribes proclaimed aloud the names of their executed husbands. Traitors, insurgents, enemies of Egypt. Each name spoken was immediately followed by a formal curse, a ritualized chant designed to erase their memory from existence. But the pharaoh demanded more than verbal denunciation. He advanced forward wearing the blue war crown, the ceremonial crook and flail crossed upon his chest. In a voice that carried across the assembled court, he pronounced, "Let those who shared the affections of my enemies now share their destiny. Let all Egypt witness that no alliance, no womb, no woman will provide sanctuary for rebellion." The priests executed his will. What transpired next was not swift execution. It was prolonged, calculated degradation, a ritual specifically designed to destroy the spirit before destroying the flesh. The captives were forced to kneel while offerings were presented to the gods. Their names were physically struck from official records, their family lineages officially declared extinct. Each woman was branded with the symbol of a shattered falcon, the permanent mark identifying those who had violated divine order. When the ritual concluded, they were not released. They were not granted merciful death. Instead, they were escorted to the desert's edge where the pharaoh's forced labor camps operated. There, the wives of kings became slaves working stone. They hauled limestone blocks for temples whose interiors they would never see. They ground grain for soldiers who ridiculed their foreign prayers. Some survived for weeks. Others endured only days. For Ramesses, their suffering was never concealed. Messengers were deliberately dispatched to borderlands carrying detailed accounts of what had transpired. The message required no interpretation. Egypt forgives nothing. Egypt forgets nothing. The priests officially recorded the ritual as a magnificent triumph of divine justice. But in the palace's hidden corners, servants whispered that the pharaoh's vengeance had violated sacred boundaries, that the gods themselves might withdraw their favor from him. Months elapsed. The anguished cries of the punished wives gradually faded into the desert winds. But something more ominous began fermenting within the palace walls. Where fear dominates too extensively for too long, loyalty withers in darkness. Servants whispered that the gods had turned away from Ramesses. Temple offerings inexplicably spoiled overnight. Oil lamps flickered despite still air, and priests began experiencing recurring dreams of falcons plummeting from the sky. The identical broken falcon that had been seared into the captive's flesh. The magnificent halls of Medine Habu still blazed with golden splendor. But beneath that surface brilliance, corruption had taken root. The pharaoh who had once governed the world's most prosperous empire now found himself isolated by silence and mistrust. Even his concubines moved through corridors with downcast eyes. The triumphant songs once performed celebrating his victories were replaced by hushed speculation about a curse. Inside the women's quarters, the atmosphere was suffocating with incense and terror. The wives of courtiers and military officers who had witnessed the fate of the captive women began fearing for their own survival. They had observed what happened to disobedience. Now they questioned. If the pharaoh could inflict such horrors on the wives of foreign kings, what might he eventually do to them? It was here, among silk curtains and closely guarded secrets, that the initial whispers of conspiracy took form. A woman named T, one of Ramesses' secondary wives, began quietly assembling allies. She had witnessed the pharaoh's brutality firsthand. She had observed how he punished the innocent, how his obsession with absolute control had consumed his judgment, and she understood that without action, her own son would never ascend to the throne. Tia's strategy was simultaneously simple and suicidal. She would strike directly at the heart of divine authority itself. She began establishing connections with those who had sacrificed everything to the pharaoh's paranoia. Military officers who had been demoted, priests who had been publicly humiliated, administrative officials bypassed for advancement. She offered them hope combined with vengeance. But in Egypt, conspiracies never remained concealed indefinitely. Dream interpreters began reporting disturbing visions of serpents in the royal bedchamber. The chief scribe discovered mysterious messages scorched into papyrus scrolls, names crossed out and replaced with others. The palace guards experienced an inexplicable sense of foreboding. When intelligence about the conspiracy finally reached the pharaoh's attention, he laughed dismissively. He had constructed his empire on fear. He believed fear would shield him eternally. But fear is a weapon that cuts in both directions. What Ramesses failed to perceive was that his own court had already ceased believing in his divinity. They obeyed through habit and self-preservation, not genuine devotion. And once that fundamental belief collapsed, even the world's most powerful man became merely a mortal awaiting his reckoning. The night it occurred, Thebes was eerily silent. The wind that typically sang through temple courtyards had completely stilled. Even the sacred cats that prowled the palace corridors seemed to sense approaching catastrophe. In his private bedchamber, Ramesses III prepared for sleep. He believed the danger had been neutralized. He had ordered arrests, interrogations, and executions weeks earlier, convinced he had eliminated the conspiracy before it matured. But what he did not know was that the genuine traitors remained inside his palace, patiently waiting. T's co-conspirators had moved with extraordinary caution. They had bribed guards, replaced trusted servants, and concealed messages inside ritual offerings and perfumed oils. Every detail of the pharaoh's evening routine was thoroughly documented. The precise hour he consumed his wine, the moment his chamber doors were sealed, even which guards would fall asleep at their posts first. That night, Ramesses reclined on his bed of carved cedar with linen sheets perfumed with lotus oil. He was elderly now, physically diminished, slower in movement, yet still convinced of his divine nature. To the conspirators observing from the shadows, he appeared less like a god and more like an exhausted old man who had lived too long. The attack came with brutal swiftness. A blade flashed in the flickering torchlight. Bronze, curved, ceremonial, the identical type of knife used in temple sacrifices. Ramesses attempted to rise, but hands that had once commanded empires proved no match for calculated betrayal. The blade cut deep across his throat, permanently silencing the voice that had once issued commands to nations. Palace servants claimed they heard nothing unusual. Others insisted they witnessed priests transporting something wrapped in linen through the corridors before dawn. By morning, the pharaoh was gone, his death obscured behind the formal language of religious ritual. The court officially announced that the great lord had peacefully joined the gods. But truth cannot remain buried indefinitely. The judicial papyrus of Turin, discovered centuries later, revealed every detail of the conspiracy, the names of T's allies, the trials that followed, the executions that eliminated an entire generation of court officials. Some conspirators were burned alive, others were mutilated and abandoned for scavengers. Even T herself vanished completely from historical records, her ultimate fate deliberately left unrecorded. For Egypt, this represented more than the death of a single ruler. It signified the death of divine order itself. A pharaoh had been murdered not by foreign invaders, but by members of his own household. The god-king had bled exactly like any mortal man. And in that blood, Egypt confronted its own reflection, the inevitable cost of power constructed on fear and cruelty. When Ramesses III's mummified remains were discovered in the 19th century, scientists identified a deep wound across his throat. Clean, deliberate, unmistakable. The blade had cut through flesh and bone, proof that the pharaoh who destroyed his enemies' wives died exactly as they did, silent, betrayed, and utterly powerless.